Hey mate, here's this video that I said to you I was going to do about Flashabou and these heads. So I'll go through all of the pieces on the table to give you an idea of what I'm going to use, and then we'll start putting it together. Flashabou, obviously that's going to go on there. Head, we've got an elastic band which we will use for the Flashabou. It will hold it in place, we'll get to that. This lure's got wings, so there's a couple of wings that are going to go on it. There's a bait knife, a bait needle, a pair of scissors, some super glue and some 35-pound wax floss. You can use braid for that job as well. I've used like 50-pound braid, it works pretty good too. Start off with the wings. So in this case, what I like to do is try and measure up where I'm going to put the wing on the side of the head in relation to where the eye is. Hold everything in place, and then I'll just put a tiny little dab of glue on the head, and it's normally enough to hold it. Okay. So now I've got both wings glued in place, what I generally like to do is to try and put a couple of wraps underneath before I put the Flashabou in, and that just makes sure that those wings can't get pulled out at all. So standard procedure, you'd know how to do this just like you skirt or your other skirts, whatever it is the knot you like to use and however you do it. I just want to get a couple on there to make sure everything's not going anywhere. Then I'll go back through and tie it all off. Stop. Okay, so now we're going to start putting the Flashabou on. Now this stuff can get pretty unruly if you don't deal with it right. In this case I'm going to, obviously I've got two colours, I've got whatever they call that, light purple and I think that's actually blue, dark blue. So obviously I'll try and orientate them so one's on the belly and one's on the back, so it looks half sensible. What we try and do is make sure that all the strands are straight, everything's tidy and neat before we go there. Then we're going to place it with that metal clip, or whatever you want to call that, staple or whatever holds that together, sticking out the top. We're going to do the same on the other side, and they're going to be about the same amount sticking up from the back of the lure head. So in both cases, now we've got those two things in place. This, like most lures, it's got two tails, one for each skirt. So what I do is I take an elastic band and wrap it around the tail that would have the underskirt on it, and that's what we generally do. Once we get to that point, so now we've got those two bits of Flashabou, two chunks of Flashabou elastic banded in place. So as we said before, they're elastic banded onto the back tail that your underskirt would go on. Now what we've got to try and do is spread this stuff out a little bit so it's even. I like to obviously try and get half and half of my light colour and half of my dark colour, spread fairly evenly across the whole head. And by evenly, I mean an even spread of the material too. So obviously when you first put it on, if you just pull the sides out, you get a bit of a lump going on in the middle. I try and spread the whole thing out as neatly as I can and get myself where I've got an even amount of strands distributed around the head, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So now we're at this point in the show where everything's relatively neat and tidy. The whole thing's inverted, that elastic band's holding it all together, and it's just about ready to tie at this stage. So now we're going to try and lash all this in place. So to do that, you just want to really try and make sure that all those strands are nice and there's no afro going on. There's no twisted, fouled up, tangled hair deals. Everything's nice and neat and tidy, which isn't always that easy because the stuff's so thin and fine. Sometimes if you've got a fan or something on, you've got to turn it off to make sure you can get control of it. Now I'm at a point where I'm going to try and put my first lash around. So same deal, just like you would anything else. But I lash it in place as tight as I can. I use the method of using my tag to create a loop, which I then whip over the top of. But what I try and do is keep forcing those strands of whipping material as far forward and as tight to the head as I can possibly get it. So the tighter I can get it, and putting a few of those on there really helps seat all that stuff up nice and tight against the back of the head. Same deal as always, that's all bound into position. I cut my end off. I go back through that little pull through that I've made for myself. Lay everything into position. Sometimes finding the tag is a bit tricky because it's blended in with all those hairs. He's there somewhere, I just got to dig him out. Still digging. Pull on that tag and everything disappears like it would do normally. I then tie an overhand knot in it all, which I think helps hold it all together. If you can get all the 10 million strands away from the one strand it is that you're after, which I think I've just about done there now. So same, try and get rid of any loose ones back out of the way, and I just go with an overhand knot and then split the ends. And now that gives me a little tiny little nub, but you won't notice it once you put the strands back over the top of it when everything folds back the other way. At this point, if you want to, it doesn't also hurt you to put a drip of super glue on there. I think it just stops the potential for any unravelling. I haven't had any unravel. The only time I had problems is obviously when something with teeth gets hold of them. Generally with marlins and yellowfins and stuff, they don't seem to destroy them, and what you find is a lot of the cases with fish like wahoos, they don't actually chop the skirts up, their teeth go sort of through that stuff. I guess it's able to slide between their teeth instead of being like a piece of rubber that just gets chopped up every time. Given that a little bit of time to go off, that glue's gone off, next thing you do is you're going to take that rubber band off. So it's not doing anything anymore. That rubber band was purely there just to hold it in place until we got the lashing on. So you can get rid of that rubber band, and what I tend to do at this point is try and cut this stuff away. If you try with scissors, it's not always that easy. I found a knife's probably the easiest way to deal with the stuff, and I'll just kind of saw through it. And that seems about the easiest way to cut it off, and also to cut it off neatly with the direction of the head. If you try and use scissors, you can't really cut around an even circle. So we'll do the same on the other side. Last couple of strands. There we go. So now you've got the whole thing. It's all trimmed off relatively neatly, so when we fold it back over the top of itself, we're not going to have strands sticking out over the top of our real skirt. It's all neat and tidy and tucked in. Next thing to do is obviously turn the whole show over and try and sort all this out a little bit. Often it will be a bit all over the place to start off with, but by slowly working your way through it, you should be able to get all those strands where you want them. Obviously the wings make it a little bit more complicated because they catch a bit of strands here and there. You'll have the odd strand fall out, but on the whole, not many. You know, I think there's 1,700 strands or something in a bundle, so if a couple fall out here and there, it's certainly not the end of the world. But it's way better to get them out now before you start your next wrap. So in our case, we've got wings, we're going to keep those out of the way, but now we've got to try and get this into a position where it's neat, tidy, and ready to whip over. This can be a bit tricky. So the easiest way I've found to do it is to keep stroking your hair through it, hands through the hair as it were, like you're trying to sort out a ponytail almost. But it's any time that you start to lose control, it all rapidly goes to custard. So it's a question of trying to hold everything in place simultaneously and get it tightened up against the bottom of the head. And by doing that, you kind of keep all these strands under control a little bit, certainly long enough that you can get another whip over the top of them, which is how we hold it all in place. So we're going to pull off a bit more thread, same as before, but in this case I like to start really close to the back of the head, for the first wrap or two, and then what I do is kind of like move those back, and what that does is it helps hold everything down tight. We've really pulled it down as tight as we can possibly get it. For this stage of the game, I only generally go with 2 or 3 wraps as enough, and instead of back tying it, I just go with one overhand knot, which I'll pull up and I'll show you in a second. But we'll cut that off there. I like to try and keep the knots dead centre, like you would if you were rigging a bait. So it comes a question of trying to get everything married up in the centre with those 2 strands, tying an overhand knot in it again like we did before. Same deal, try and split those strands. Pull it down tight, so that knot's pretty well centred. Then, just as a little precaution to make sure that that knot isn't going to move, can't go anywhere, I cut the strands off a touch longer than I want, and then get a cigarette lighter, and very, very carefully, so you don't have a melting catastrophe on your hands, use the base of the flame and just nub out that little tiny tag end. Once that's melted, that means that that knot can't go anywhere because it's got a stopper on the back of it. Once you fold your wings back into position, I don't lash those, I leave them the way they are. I fold them into position, try and kind of crease them to where you want them to stay, and that's your finished lure. You can then have the choice to cut that skirt back or make it as long as you want. I guess overall that's like about generally an 8-inch sort of size lure. Currently with what I've got on it, it is 10.5. So you have the option to either leave it that bit longer or you can trim it to whatever you want. You could trim it to 9, 8, whatever you felt like. And that, in a nutshell, is how to skirt one of those things using Flashabou and wings.